Good morning, everyone. It is Thursday, May 18th, 2023. It is D-Day. It is Mullivaikkaal Remembrance Day today. I don't know if you can already tell. We already have people already in the Discord ready to go. I took the day off just to do this. So this is how important Mullivaikkaal is to me personally. Woke up early for this. This is how important Mullivaikkaal is to us as Tamil people. This has been an issue that has been largely, I've been fighting for people to care about this issue on this platform. This is the struggles of the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka, what they're going through, what the various struggles that they're going through, the sort of, we'll get into it, the war crimes that happen in Sri Lanka, all of that, we're going to get into it. Yeah, it's good that you continue to cover this because holy crap, the degree to which the whole rest of the planet completely ignored this this stuff happening in Sri Lanka is absolutely inexcusable. I think my take, and I think Ambika's take, is going to be a lot more nuanced than that. How's it going, everyone? So if you guys want to just introduce yourselves to the chat.
Hi, everybody. My name is the Love Slug. You can just call me Slug. I'm a Slug Boy VTuber. I do cover politics a little bit. It's not really so much the focus of my content like it is for some of the other people in this panel today. But I do have a tendency to get stun-locked and yell about it. So I'm very excited to be included as a part of this conversation today and excited to learn a lot.
Hi, I'm Vio. I do everything, honestly. I've been watching trash TV. I do a little bit of political commentary. I've been doing a lot of commentary on the streaming space in general. Honestly, like anything and everything that you can think of. And I stream Monday through Friday, and I start normally around like 9 a.m. EST. But yeah, that's me. Hello, hi.
Mike from PA, you can go next.
Well, this is Mike from PA. I have a little stream on twitch.tv called The Central Committee, and I cover news and politics from a leftist perspective. As a longtime political operative, I was a candidate for the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. Went to law school, and I got my start on the Majority Report as a producer with Sam Cedar. So now we have our own program, the Central Committee, where we talk about, politics, philosophy, history, and any of the, electoral politics and how that can interface with a much more radical praxis. So a little bit of an interesting stream. It's an older crowd than your typical Twitch stream and more balanced in gender. And so I'm proud that we've built that. And I'm happy to be here. If you've never encountered me before, or if you have in other less wholesome places, I want to encourage you to come on by, check it out.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ambika Satkunanathan from Sri Lanka, human rights advocate. I've been working, for 5 years. I was a commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Before that, for 8 years, I was a legal advisor to the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I work on issues such as police brutality, militarization, penal policy, drug control and rehabilitation, transitional justice, and I do a lot of work with the war-affected communities, particularly in the north of Sri Lanka.
Okay, so I just want to highlight, I just want to underscore sort of the, highlight and underscore sort of the prolific career that Ambika has had in Sri Lanka. As she has mentioned, she is a former human rights commissioner. She's done a lot of work with regards to militarization and a lot of human rights work with regards to the war-torn affected areas of the North and East.
Yeah.
And we will get into that for a second. So before we sort of just go ahead, if we had to do a sort of, a sort of intro to Sri Lankan politics, right? If we had to do a sort of intro to Sri Lankan politics, right? How would you walk us through? What has been, let's start with this. What is Mullivaikkaal and why is May 18th important? Let's start with that question for a second.
Okay. Mullivaikkaal is the north of Sri Lanka. That is when the last stages of the war took place. The war ended, the people crossed over and came into government or military controlled areas, and May 18th is when it happened. So it signaled the end of the war, but for many people it was also in the south the war was celebrated. It was a victory, but for the people of the north in particular and for Tamils in general, it was also about the loss, the killings, the shellings, the disappearances, the pain, the suffering. So May 18th is when the community gathers in Mullivaikkaal, in Mullaitivu in the north, where the last stages of the war took place. And they remember all those who are lost with a simple ceremony. That is Mullivaikkaal.
So for those of you who are new to the stream, that are new to this sort of this context, Sri Lanka had a 25-year-long civil war that started in 1983 with Black July, which we can get into at some point later in this sort of discussion. And as Ambika has mentioned, and this entire stream is built upon, it ended in the Mullivaikkaal massacre, named after the town in which it took place. It's Mullivaikkaal in the northern province of Sri Lanka. And during the final stages of the civil war, effectively what happened was plenty of crimes against humanity actually happened. Lots of war crimes happened. As Ambika has alluded to, shellings of hospitals, shellings of, in particular, there were these no-fire zones that were set up as agreements between, basically these are zones where neither the rebel group at the time, the LTTE, otherwise known as the Tamil Tigers, neither them nor the Sri Lankan army, the Sri Lanka armed forces, were allowed to fire into. But what ended up happening over the course of the final stages of the Civil War, and there's an entire website called Remember May 2009, which you can go to, which details the sort of the events. It gives you a timeline of the events of the final stages of the Civil War, and it is a very harrowing account of what actually happened. What happened was incredibly harrowing, as Ambika might be able to elucidate. It was, I saw this documentary that detailed these sorts of events, and I'll just provide my perspective as I'm a Tamil person, but I come from India. My family's all from India. And so when I was a kid, when I was, well, not a kid, but when I was an adolescent, I was exposed to this. I was exposed to the sort of horrific atrocities that were committed by, largely speaking, the Sri Lanka armed forces in Mullivaikkaal and in Mullaitivu, the district of Mullaitivu. But Ambika, if you want to sort of go ahead and give sort of your story on this, and if you want to basically give us an idea of, what was actually, what actually happened when that was going on.
Okay, we've had many peace processes in Sri Lanka, and the well, all the peace processes broke down. And the breakdown of the last peace process is what finally led the end of the war. The last stage was at the end of the war. It started in the Eastern Province with the government taking over the Eastern Province. And they slowly moved to the north as they were, and I think the Rajapaksa family, the Rajapaksas, Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president at this time, and his family.
Sorry to cut you off. For context, so for those of you who might have seen it last year, so the Rajapaksa family, that is Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is at this point, I believe, the defense minister, right?
The Secretary Defense.
Secretary of Defense. So he was the Secretary of Defense at the time. His brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, was the president. Those were the two main figures that you saw that were deposed in the recent 2022, what is called the Argalaya. But these, you may have seen pictures, or you may have seen videos of people bathing in the presidential pool and working out in the presidential gym. Those were the two occupants of those were the two occupants of the two highest positions in Sri Lanka at the time. The Rajapaksas, Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and they were two of the main chief forces that existed, that were in power at the time of the final stages of the Civil War. Go ahead, continue. Sorry to cut you off.
No worries. So the Rajapaksas, well, the brothers claim, they have claimed that they won an unwinnable war. But my theory has always been the previous, presidents or governments were not able to, quote unquote, win the war was because they were not willing to go all the way in committing the war crimes and crimes against humanity and decimating a population there. They were just not willing to do that. They stopped at a point, which is why they were not able to, quote unquote, win the war. Whereas the Rajapaksas had no qualms at all. It was like carpet bombing. It was bombing and shelling agreed upon places that were under IHL. They were protected places. There were no fire zones. So after the agreement, and even the locations of the zones would be given, the locations of the hospitals would be given, and thereafter they would be shelled and bombed. So harrowing war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed. For instance, you may have heard of the Channel 4 documentary, which has visuals, videos that were clearly taken from or provided by members of the armed forces, because they were recorded on mobile phones, or men being blindfolded, stripped, their arms tied. You see them alive, and then you see them lying dead. You see Isai Priya, she was a young newsreader for the LTTE, so she was not a combatant. And you see her being helped out of the lagoon, half clothed, and then you see her dead. You see the young, the child, the youngest son of the leader of the LTTE, you see him seated, bare-bodied, wearing shorts and a sarong draped over him, eating a pack, biscuits from a pack in his hand. And then you see him dead, shot dead, clearly at close range. So those were the crimes that were committed, and the crimes for which the Tamil community is still demanding truth, justice, reparations, and also the right to memorialize. Now, the right to memorialize, to remember, is something that is also being violated by the state repeatedly in different ways. For instance, this time what happened was that in the Eastern Province, someone who organized an event, and they had a banner which said Tamil Genocide Day, and for that the person was arrested. The word genocide, clearly.
Yes.
Then, sorry?
No. I was agreeing with you. Yes, we did. Yeah,
And
go
then
ahead.
today, just today, the same organization in a different part of the Eastern Province, they received a court order. It was delivered late because the court order had been given yesterday, but it was delivered only today after they'd already completed about 4 events and they had only one more event to complete. It was banning 13 persons from that organization from engaging in any events, and they said that this would cause harm to, I think, public health, lives, and create disunity between the communities. So even the right to memorialize is being criminalized. Demands for truth and justice are being criminalized, and they seem to have the trigger is the word genocide, which clearly it's not a crime to use it. You can agree or disagree whether genocide was committed. That is, that's just freedom of expression. You can do that. And so the use of the word should not be criminalized. And it's not an offense to use the word, and it shouldn't be. But people are being now targeted for that.
And this is largely due to the fact that the phrase Tamil genocide is largely associated, I mean, at least in popular conscience, it is largely associated with members or sympathizers of the LTTE. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure about that, whether it is that, but it's also the fact that it's a trigger because it means they have committed such a grave crime. The gravest crime in international humanitarian criminal law is genocide. And it's about an intention to destroy in part or whole a group. So I think it's more the fact that is such a heinous crime and they know it, and to be accused of it. And they believe that those who are alleging it have a political motive, and the motive is that is driven by LTT ideology, etc. I suppose that is how they think, one assumes, given their behavior.
Yeah. So it's basically to get an understanding of what you're saying. It's basically because they're kind of self-aware. They're very well aware of what happened, but they just don't want to take accountability for it. They're incredibly well aware of what happened, but they don't want to take accountability for it.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think, and this is going to sort of descend into this entire stream is going to be very triggering, but I think one of the things that is horrifying, but that genuinely stood out to me when researching all of this was I've shown this to a lot of people on this stream, on my own broadcast, on many other broadcasts when talking about this, but there is a separate Wikipedia article dedicated to the accounts and incidences of rape and sexual violence towards Tamil men, women, and children on the island. Could you speak to that a little bit and sort of show how, just to demonstrate how prolific a problem that has been on the island for such a long time?
Well, sexual violence is also not something that has been recorded. Sexual violence is not something the women would want to talk about. There is that, but there have been the incidents like, for instance, schoolgirl Krishanti Kumaraswamy, who was raped and murdered, and her brother and mother who went looking for her were also murdered and buried at Chemmani. So the graves at Chemmani, a place in the north in the Jaffna Peninsula. And the person who, there was only one person who was convicted for that, although many were involved. Then there were other cases where, in one case where the parents, the little girl and the little boy were murdered, and the mother and the daughter, the little girl, were clearly raped. But so there are, not all incidents are recorded. Now, for instance, in the Eastern Province, after the split of the LTTE and Karuna So the LTT also split. And so the Eastern Command, Karuna Pillian, they joined the government of the time and they functioned as paramilitary. So during that time, they also engaged in extortion, in kidnappings, in enforced disappearances, and also abduction of women. And there were allegations of rape, sexual violence. But once again, these are not always openly recorded. And because many of the women also just do not want to come forward because they have no faith in the system, because of the stigma, various reasons like that. So there are civil society organizations that have recorded many cases because the women have gone to them, not because they want to file a formal complaint, but because they want some sort of a support, most often psychological, maybe issues with families. So there are many cases that have not been publicly reported, and certainly complaints not made to the state authorities.
So it's basically not just, so it's not only just, so basically the list that we see, those are just the documented cases of what we've seen. But the amount of undocumented cases is would be mind-numbing to try and fathom.
Not just in relation to that. In Sri Lanka, I would say there are undocumented cases in relation to custodial violence, in relation to even enforced disappearances. Because there are people who even as recently as a couple of years ago had not reported, families I met, persons I met who had not reported the enforced disappearance to anyone at all except to ICRC, and reporting to ICRC will never get out because that is always confidential. So that means it has not been recorded anywhere. And this was just 2 years ago. I met someone, which means there are many cases of all sorts of violations that have not been documented.
Christ. We'll get to the custodial violence and we'll get to the police state in just a second, but I want to read a quote that one of the, and you can corroborate whether this is true or not. I'm sure you can probably attest to this. I want to stay on the topic of the Civil War for a second, and I also want to get to Black July because that is also the start of the Civil War, and I want to get to your, I read your personal account of Black July and sort of your experiences afterwards, but I want to get to that. But before that, there's a quote that is truly, I think, a bone-chilling quote that this is a person in a high-ranking, position in not just the Sri Lankan government, but the Sri Lankan army. They said this, and I quote, this is in response to consistently denying the charges of mass rape. Throughout their training, our boys are taught to hate the tigers. They see them as disgusting animals, not fit to live. I'm 200% sure that they didn't rape Tamil women. Why would they fuck them if they hate them so much? And I quote. Go ahead.
Well, that just shows the deep, firstly, the misogyny in Sri Lankan society, and also the military, and just generally about the military and military structures. And it's about the patriarchal nature of it and the misogynistic nature of it, which are anyway, I think, anti-women, all that. So I would say, well, that the quote doesn't surprise me at all, because that is the viewpoint that they had. In general, I think during training, that is what you are taught, how to view the enemy and what to do. So it's not a quote that surprises at all, but just illustrates the deep divisions between the communities, the deep hatred, ethno-nationalism driven hatred, and deep misogyny that exists. And when you that's a deadly combination, which results in, all these violations. The fact that you can shoot at close range. A boy, how old was he? I think it was like 10 or something.
He was 12. He was actually, sorry to cut you off.
12.
He was quite literally my age when he died.
He was, 12-year-old kid. And you can just line people up, blindfold them, strip them, tie their hands, and then just brutally shoot them. And there are many other videos of various other senior high-ranking officers who are seen in very normal, pleasant conversation after the end of the war, photographs also, with senior military officers, and then you see them dead. So the brutality of it also, and that's one of the most heinous war crimes, is killing people who have surrendered. Killing prisoners of war is one of the most heinous war crimes, and taken very seriously in international humanitarian law. But just the brutality of it, and that is larger in Sri Lankan society, the normalization of brutality generally. The state is very brutal. It's been normalized. We see that in the way the state structures and entities treat citizens generally, but also particularly how the police functions. So that, I think, it goes broader than the military to broader Sri Lankan society, state, political culture, everything.
Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say that it was really, I find that a really curious defense, the idea that we've dehumanized these people so much we don't even consider them human. Therefore, we wouldn't commit the crime of rape, which you could only commit against a human person. So that, I think that almost sounded like a confession to me rather than a denial. The idea that we have so thoroughly dehumanized our enemies and we want to exterminate them, that, that almost seems a boast rather than a denial.
It's also something quite common where sexual violence is concerned, because I think, wasn't it Trump in his recent trial? I think he made a similar comment like that. So that is very common in sexual violence, where they say, well, she's so ugly, why would I do that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's the nature of this conflict, it seems to me, is the extreme dehumanization.
Yeah.
If I could ask a question, what is the reaction to the world and for the weapons suppliers of the government and the military forces in this conflict? Because it seems that, I don't seem to recall Sri Lanka being a country with a large arms industry. So it doesn't seem to me that the means to do these war crimes would be available, from the domestic market. So how did that happen? How is this supplied? And, how can we act to prevent this kind of stuff in the future, if at all?
Well, firstly, I think you don't always need sophisticated weapons to commit war crimes. To commit some war crimes you do, to commit others you don't. So there is that. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it was clearly, yes, we do not have an arms industry. And so we had suppliers globally who are also part of, I suppose, complicit in these violations in some way, because most of them did want to see the destruction of the LTT. And this was a price, I suppose, they were prepared to pay, because it was not a price they had to pay, it was a price someone else had to pay.
Yeah. And to give you an idea of the countries that are involved in all of this, I joke about, when talking about such a serious topic and when talking about a topic that is genuinely this grave, and you kind of have to bring some sort of levity, otherwise it is truly a harrowing topic to talk about. But one of the, I guess, jokes that I make is every country you might have heard CNN talk about is they probably sold arms or they probably trained Sri Lankan troops at one point or another. So this includes the United States, India, Pakistan, Russia, China, Israel, the United Kingdom, Iran, Ukraine, North Korea, and Australia. These are countries that have either provided weapons to the Sri Lanka army, to the Sri Lankan armed forces, or they have actually done special military training of the Sri Lankan armed forces troops. And on top of that, both India and the United States provided coastal surveillance towards the final stages of the Civil War, particularly because, wait, let me go back 1 second. Sorry about that. So they provided a, because the LTTE had a navy, which is why there was coastal surveillance as well. When we talk about this issue, it is genuinely a absolute failure. It is an absolute catastrophe. It is a failure of the international community. And I think Ambika would agree on that. It is a failure of not just obviously you have a cornucopia of governments that are complicit in this, in these war crimes, in these crimes against humanity. But you also have the Red Cross that's complicit in this too. The reason that those hospitals were bombed with deadly accuracy is because the Red Cross, in their infinite naivete, was given, in their infinite naivete, they were giving coordinates to the Sri Lankan government so that the hospitals would not be bombed. But the bombings of those hospitals, and these are not proper hospitals, by the way. These are makeshift hospitals in these no-fire zones. They were largely set up next to schools, right? The bombings of these hospitals became so not just frequent but systematic that it was concluded that the Red Cross giving these coordinates to the Sri Lankan government was the main reason that these hospitals were bombed with such frequency. Am I correct in that assessment?
Well, in all fairness, yes. I mean, it's because they were given the coordinates that they did bomb them, because the bombings happened. They started soon after the coordinates were given. But in all fairness, you cannot also blame the ICRC, because that is part of the process. And in order to protect, you do give it to both parties, and that is an agreement, and you expect both parties to uphold it. So when you do declare no-fire zones, or you designate a place as a hospital and it's a protected space, then both parties are given those coordinates to ensure that that place is protected. But as we have seen, not just in Sri Lanka, but many other places globally, these agreements are constantly broken. So I think in that sense, the blame lies entirely with the Sri Lankan government, because the ICRC had to do that. That was just part of the process.
Can I just jump here and say, isn't this really, you mentioned a failure of the international community. If the international organizations like the Red Cross and Red Crescent are providing these locations so that there will be a compliance with Geneva Conventions and laws of war, and then one of the belligerents uses those coordinates to target civilians, isn't it on the international community to then impose consequences on the belligerent that does violate those agreements, or those agreements are worthless because they are just paper at that point? If there's no enforcement, if there's no international condemnation, how can you rely on those documents to protect civilians?
Well, as someone who also worked in the UN system for 8 years and was in the UN system during the last stages of the war, and who saw how the UN system can fail you miserably, and how even large parts of the UN system are themselves hostile to human rights, and therefore were hostile to the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So we were shut out of meetings, we were kept on the periphery, we were not listened to. It was like working in a hostile environment against not colleagues, but it felt like, I don't want to use, not enemies, but people who were, who just didn't want you there. Therefore, the problem with the international system, at least the UN system, is that there is no enforcement power. The only enforcement power would be economic sanctions, and those are very difficult to get, and only the Security Council can impose them. And then there are countries there with veto power. So the lack of ability to enforce these documents, and where international humanitarian law is concerned, many of the Geneva Conventions are customary law, which means forget the paper. They're just custom, and everyone is expected to follow them. They're customary law.
Not to mention that these sanctions, any sanctions that would go onto Sri Lanka, would be collective punishment for the people at large that are already, held under oppression.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, one possible move would be to cut off weapon sales, but obviously, when there's profit to be made, somebody's going to do it, right? Under our international system. I guess even if some major parties withdraw weapons sales, others might not for money.
And at the time, everything had been sold anyway. So by the time this happened, so it was too late. I mean, there was nothing to stop. Everything had been sold. Everything had been.
Oh, I have a question. Is there a good kind of information that people can access? So, that a lot of people are probably not even aware of this conflict, in my community, and it's not their fault. It just wasn't a big story in Western media, especially since it's been, over 10 years. Is there a good resource that people can look at so that they could, become informed about this anniversary and what it all means?
So there's a website called remembermay2009.com. So it's called remembermay2009.com. Basically what that website is it will actually walk you through the timeline. So I can, if someone can post it in your chat, or that basically it's actually a very well put together timeline of what actually happened during the final stages of the Civil War. And it usually is covering regarding, 2008, 2009, which is when the Civil War actually ended. Yeah. So Prodigy put it in my chat. That's a very good starter resource, I think, for what actually to give you an illustration of what actually happened. There's a documentary by the name, it's a BBC Channel 4 documentary by the name of Sri Lanka's Killing Fields. Tamil Guardian is a particularly good source. Yes, Tamil Guardian is also a very good source on this. If you want to learn about Tamil affairs, generally speaking, in the northern parts of Sri Lanka, Tamil Guardian is probably the only source that you're going to find, if I'm going to be honest. On Twitter, I'm moving really fast, but there's a Twitter account called Lanka Files, which I highly recommend. Lanka Files is another Twitter account. But if you actually want to know what's going on in Sri Lanka, and we'll get to some of the topics later on, such as the Sinhalization of the North and the East, our guest actually has a Twitter account, and she does a lot of, informal on the ground reporting of what's actually happening in the North and the East. And she was actually talking, one of the things that we're going to get to are the two anti-terrorism laws. The first one is the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which was passed, I believe, in 1979. And we're also going to talk about the recent replacement to that, which is called the Anti-Terrorism Act, which is currently being opposed right now. But effectively, the difference between the ATA and the PTA is that the new law actually adds the death penalty onto the books. For the past several decades or so, Sri Lanka had a moratorium on the death penalty, and they were actually effectively informally, not necessarily on paper, but they were at least informally, moving away from using the death penalty. And with the recent passage of the ATA, they have now formalized the ATA on the books, and they've also. And Ambika will be able to correct me on when I'm wrong about this, but it also gives the power to the military directly to arrest people. So it allows the Sri Lankan armed forces to actually make arrests, on Sri Lankan soil. And the danger of these laws is that these laws have largely been used to arrest the minority Tamils, especially those in the north. They've been used to especially harass the Tamils of the northeastern side. As Ambika has alluded to earlier, as mentioned earlier, there was an incident where a Mullivaikkaal, remembrance participator was actually arrested for having the term Tamil genocide on the banner. And there was recently a court order and that was in Batticaloa, where that was the incident in Batticaloa. There was another one, I believe, in the same eastern province or the northern province where there's a court order where put out against the Mullivaikkaal Remembrance Day. And one of my mods right now is giving her Twitter, Ambika Satkunanathan's Twitter. Highly recommend following her. It is, I get a lot of sort of my understanding of my on the ground news in Sri Lanka from her, along with a bunch of other on the ground journalists in Sri Lanka. So that's usually how I get my information. But a good intro into this, and I know I went off on a long-winded rant, but I think a good starter to basically understand what actually happened was rememberedmay2009.com. Really well, designed timeline of events. And then on top of that, I've mentioned this before, there is a documentary, BBC Channel 4 documentary by the name of Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, which I highly recommend watching. Those give you sort of an idea of, what actually happened there. And obviously, I don't think I need to say this. It is a massive trigger warning. It is genuinely brutal. It is one of the most brutal things. It is quite possibly one of the most brutal things you'll watch.
So Arun, you and I have had multiple conversations about the topic. One of the things, particularly because these are leftist communities that are learning about this today, one of the things that I had to dispel from this was the notion that because we're leftists, we often think that these things are out of whole cloth Western imperialism, right? That this is U.S. backed. It's for the entire U.S. State Department's endeavors, like why this is happening, and that is, as I understand it from you talking in the past, not the case. Could you kind of dispel that notion, and where it does exist, kind of in, I guess not the Western imperialism aspect of it isn't explicit, right? It's that it's kind of
it's much so. I think yes. Right? So basically, to answer your question, so I think a lot of leftists, especially those that are just beginning to, especially those in the West that are beginning to understand like what socialism is and stuff like that. I think I see a lot of mistakes that are made, especially with regards to this topic. The first mistake is, as you mentioned, any conflict in the world must be a directly U.S.-backed coup or a CIA-backed coup. There was absolutely U.S. involvement, which eventually led, well, not direct U.S. government involvement that later then led to this conflict. It wasn't directly the U.S. government, but I'll get to that in a second. But
didn't the U.S. government provide, not to interrupt, but just a question, because, based on my understanding of the conflict, didn't the U.S. government provide basically a don't negotiate with your enemy to the Sri Lankan military, like a statement by the State Department early January 2009 that
we don't negotiate with terrorists.
We declared the Tamil Tigers to be a terrorist organization.
Yes,
you should negotiate with them. So they represented, whether or not you agreed with the methods, they still represented a legitimate resistance movement against the Sri Lankan military. and as an armed, they were a belligerent in a conflict. It seems like if you have a civilian population that's surrounding that belligerent, that you would want to have the ability to have a negotiated surrender or some sort of terms to avoid civilian casualties or unnecessary conflict. So when the U.S. says don't negotiate to one side and we welcome the victory of one side, isn't it kind of an endorsement and kind of a go ahead and do what you need to do signal to the Sri Lankan military, which whereas the U.S. government had the opposite position, might have resulted in a more circumspect end to the war.
Yeah, so I'm going to get to that in a second. So I think both of you are right, and what I mean by that is, I think a lot of people just immediately assume that the way geopolitics works is so I'll give you an example of where I'll give you an example of something that's incredibly silly, like an incredibly silly understanding of
Sure.
Sri Lankan politics, right? So when the Aragalaya was happening, which was when the Rajapaksas were, thrown out last year, there were some people online that were, and again, they're not necessarily popular or anything, but I did see these takes. I did see this take where basically the Rajapaksas being deposed was a color revolution, was a CIA-backed color revolution. That is a very silly understanding of what actually happened. So the truth of the matter is it was obviously not CIA backed. That's crazy. The reason is there was genuine discontent among the population, and it's because of what the Rajapaksas actually did. And if you understand like the system of Sri Lankan politics and how rotten it truly is, and we'll get to how truly rotten the political system in Sri Lanka is, and how the West effectively did intervene in Sri Lankan politics, how their sort of involvement in that. But I think a lot of leftists immediately just tend to assume that these guys quote unquote spoke out against the U.S. Never mind the fact that the recently deposed president Gotabaya Rajapaksa actually fled to the United States. So forget that for a second. He was actually in a court case because he was accused of having U.S. citizenship. So, and the only reason these guys actually quote unquote spoke out against the West was because the West began to quote unquote lightly push back on the war crimes that they were committing in 2009. So it is
more hand wringing, less pushing back.
Bingo. It's not really like pushing back. It was more like it's like this. It's like that's basically what the U.S. was doing towards 2009, and that's actually why they eventually pulled out. They actually stopped selling their arms to Sri Lanka in 2007. But even though they continued to patrol the coast until then. But I think that's an example, sort of the Rajapaksas being a CIA-backed, anti-leftist revolution. I think that's a very facile understanding of what is actually happening in Sri Lanka. There was genuine discontent among the populations. The Rajapaksas effectively did bankrupt the entire country. The only reason the Rajapaksas were even elected to the first place was because they were considered, and to this day they still are to a certain degree, aside from the economic crisis. If you ask your average Sri Lankan about what they did in 2009, they'll agree with what the Rajapaksas did in 2009. They'll consider the Rajapaksas war heroes. So ultimately the reason that the Rajapaksas were elected to power later on was not real, like they were elected because they were, war criminals, because of the brutality, or because, not necessarily because of the brutality that they, inflicted in the North, but because they showed that they were willing to end the war at all costs. So that's an incredibly facile understanding. But one of the ways that the U.S. actually had an influence in, the development of Sri Lanka and sort of the discontent that happened was during British occupation of Sri Lanka, aside from obviously the weapons that were sold to Sri Lanka, and aside from the fact that, as one of my chatters mentioned, Obama effectively, when Obama was in power, effectively told the Tigers to give up. And Lakshman Kadirgama, the foreign minister at the time, effectively used the U.S. is ratcheting up of the war on terror to basically get the LTTE designated as a terrorist organization so that the U.S. would be on board to basically help the Sri Lankans fight the LTTE. Aside from all of that, part of the American intervention, quote unquote, would be the actually missionary work that was established during colonial times, which effectively, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ambika, basically what happened was during colonial times, the British administration of Sri Lanka. Now, keep in mind there's effectively a aristocratic class that has existed among both the Sinhalese and the Tamils, right? But what happened during the British was American missionaries largely were sent to the north, which were Tamil dominated, and they set up large amounts of education. They set up schools, and they basically raised the average education level of the north, which they didn't do in the south, which effectively began to lead to a little more of an overrepresentation of Tamils in the government, largely due to the American missionary work in the north. And that's actually how both Tamil nationalism and Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism actually formed. Both of those separate nationalisms formed as a response to missionary work. They were actually not, they weren't as strongly correlated with the British occupation of Sri Lanka. It was actually more or less in response to the American missionary work, especially the sort of Tamil Shaivite Hindu revival movement that was going on in the north. So that's one way that America, quote unquote, has intervened in the north, right? That's how they sort of got involved in this, aside from obviously selling weapons to Sri Lanka, and obviously besides legitimizing the war crimes that were done by the Sri Lankan government towards the final stages. The British involvement, if you want to talk about that for a second, the Kinimini services, which you can kind of think as their sort of Blackwater, they're a mercenary group in the UK that I think report to the MI6. They trained Sri Lankan troops. They actually trained Sri Lankan cops in the northern parts of Sri Lanka as the war was basically beginning to kick off. And they actually canceled their contracts because of how brutal the Sri Lankan cops were in terms of sexual assault, in terms of torture, in terms of murder. So that's one sort of mistake that I see a lot of people make. It's just like anything that happens in the world, it must be like it's an oversimplification of the ground reality. I think that's one thing that is often made. That's a mistake. There is another mistake, which we'll get to in a second, which is, automatic solidarity to, whatever parties that may be aligned with our, sort of ideological interests. We have lots of, and we can maybe get into that at some later topic, but at some later date. But at least at this point in time, especially during post 2000, the Sri Lankan communist parties are not helping the situation by any stretch of the measure. They've effectively been taken over by fascists. They've been taken over by Sinhalese nationalists. In 2005, this was when Mahinda Rajapaksa was running for president, and they backed Rajapaksa. Mahinda Rajapaksa was running as part of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party at the time. He's no longer part of that. He's formed his own coalition. And in 2010, shortly, this is 1 year after Mullivaikkaal. This is 1 year after the Civil War ended. The two main presidential candidates were again Mahinda Rajapaksa and a general by the name of Sarath Fonseca. Those were the two main candidates. And the largest communist party in Sri Lanka, the Janata Vimukti Peramuna, backed the general. They backed General Sarath Fonseca against Rajapaksa. So I think a common misconception that a lot of people make is just because they happen to fly the same flag as us, they're automatically good, when that's not necessarily the case. These guys have like it's basically they're incredible. Like, they've effectively been taken over by Sinhalese nationalists that are refusing to even address this situation, that are even refusing to bring up governance. They're not. Have they talked about the 13th Amendment, Ambika?
The left parties Well, many of them are irrelevant now in that they've disappeared. The only left party that is left standing is the JVP. The others they became part of the Rajapaksa different coalitions and therefore started singing from the same hymn sheet as the Rajapaksa. So I don't think, what they say matters. And there are people older leftists who make contradictory statements all the time, like Vasudeva Nanayakkara. So I don't think they're taken seriously at all.
Yeah.
The JVP, I think recently they did, I can't remember what they said about the full implementation. I don't think so, because also the full implementation means you also give land and police powers to the provinces.
And
that is what...
Yeah, sorry to cut you off again. I'll let you finish. But basically, the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution is very important in that, one, it establishes, it is supposed to establish Sinhala and the dominant language of the island, as well as Tamil as equal languages. That's number one. And more important, or that's also important, but probably I think the most crucial part of that amendment is that it devolves power, especially police and land, back to the provincial councils, which has not been done yet. That and if you want to elaborate more on that and why, why that's important, you can go ahead on that. I apologize for cutting you off.
Yes, 13th Amendment was to the Constitution was also negotiated by India, and therefore India has an interest in that, which is why the Tamil parties constantly appeal to India to help put pressure on the Sri Lankan government to implement it, because I suppose it's also a prestige and loss of face issue for India. It brought about, one was, of course, the language, to make Tamil also an official language. The other was to set up provincial councils to devolve power to the regions, not just the north and the east, but all over the country. But it was a demand that the Tamils had as part of, the political solution they wanted for historical and systemic structural discrimination of many forms, and violence, which they had suffered for decades. And that was never, that was undermined also because through a Supreme Court decision, it was, the decision said that certain subjects, that if there was a national policy on it, it was related to, or it was relevant nationally, then the central government would be able to make policy on it. So things like education, etc. So now you have the central government, you also have the provincial, but it's the central government that would lead. So at the start itself, the powers that were given were undermined. But the land and police powers were never devolved, and that is one of the main demands of the Tamils, particularly land, because historically there have been efforts. This is more institutionalized within the state structure, in a sense, to Sinhalize many of the Tamil areas, the Tamil majority areas, as part of changing the demographic, with the purpose of changing the number of people from those regions who would be able to represent those regions in parliament. So to reduce the number of Tamil members of parliament. And that has been ongoing through various different schemes, like agricultural schemes, like irrigation schemes, like the Mahaveli project, which is this massive irrigation project. So through that, and that has been institutionalized to the extent that right now the Department of Archaeology, the Department of Forestry, Wildlife Department are all part of this project of Sinhalization, whereby the Forestry Department would take over the agricultural lands of the Tamils and sometimes the Muslims too, claiming that it's just forestry land. And that's how they take over land. The Department of Archaeology goes to a site and declares it an archaeological site. And it could be a site of that has a place of Hindu worship, like a Hindu temple. So that temple would be destroyed and a Buddhist temple constructed in its place. Or they would say, oh, we found remnants of some sort of Buddhist heritage here, and therefore we're going to declare this an archaeological site, so then it's out of bounds. And also we've had these large military camps in the north and the east following the end of the war. The irony is in Sri Lanka, I would say militarization accelerated after the end of the war rather than during the war, because after the end of the war, the military started playing a key role even in civil administration. They started businesses, they took over land, built large military camps, started running agricultural farms in which they employed the conflict-affected population. So it became a massive kind of industrial complex here. In those military camps also, they would construct Buddhist statues and build Buddhist temples, which means, once again, even if you dismantle the camp, you can't dismantle the temple or the structure. And then for that, they would probably bring a Buddhist priest from somewhere else and he would set up shop there. So it is, in a way, colonization. And the people often ask, particularly people on the south, like, why you Tamils can live in Colombo, but why can't Sinhalese live in the north and the east? Well, we say we're not against that. We're not talking about that. People naturally migrating there. But here, this is part of a state project where people are found and they're supported and they're financed and they're sent there with the sole purpose of changing the demographic, with the intention of reducing the number of members of parliament from those areas and turning them into Sinhala areas, whereby then you could also change various things like, maybe in the future, the language of administration in those areas, etc.
So it's a full-blown, replacement and colonization of the local population via state power.
Absolutely. So, for instance, in the north, in the Jaffna Peninsula, there's a place called Navatkuli. A few years during the Good Governance government, actually, I think, was it? I'm just like, it's all hazy now, the years. Anyway, so after the end of the war, clearly sponsored by the state, because it also had the support of the military who were there protecting the people. A group of people, as Sinhalese, said that they had lived in this particular area in Navakuli, but they really didn't have any documents to show that they had lived there. And it was clearly a planned action by the state, because these people had military protection throughout. So I don't think they live there now, but what they did is they built a massive Buddhist temple there. Right? If you go by the area, you can see the Buddhist temple. And so there was protest, but then the people just gave up, and now you have the Buddhist temple. But I don't think the people the Sinhalese live around the area, because they're brought there, but they don't necessarily want to live there. It's inconvenient for them. They would want to go back home. So that's how the project worked.
There's a word for this, but let's not use that right now. But for those of you who are listening to this, you can probably, for a lot of people that are watching this broadcast right now, you probably can think of several other examples throughout the world that sound incredibly familiar to this. But, and this is just another instance of what is actually going on in Sri Lanka. So basically, that was actually another topic that I wanted to get to, which is the building of the Buddhist viharas and building of the state-sponsored backing of the sort of the Buddhist monuments. And so just a quick aside, I know we didn't actually touch upon the demographics of Sri Lanka. We kind of dived directly into it. the majority of Sri Lanka are ethnic Sinhalese. They are largely Buddhist, with a small minority of Christians. The second largest minority are the Elam Tamils, the Sri Lankan Tamils, and then come Muslims after that, and then you have what we call Malayaga Tamils or estate Tamils or Indian Tamils of Sri Lanka, which were bonded laborers that were brought from India to work tea plantations in Sri Lanka. So those are the general demographic understandings of Sri Lanka. So I just wanted to establish that because I know we dove directly into the deep end regarding this topic. But so basically, what is happening here is the state is effectively sponsoring an ethnic majority to settle in the northern and eastern parts of the country. And you have a group of people that effectively live there as second-class citizens in their own land while people are settling there, which is backed by the state. Now, if that rings any bells, feel free to let me know, but that should ring a couple of bells. If there's any more on that topic that we didn't talk about, Ambika, feel free to go ahead. I think you've given a wonderful explanation of what's actually, for example, what's actually happening. A little bit from that, let's get into a little bit of the forced disappearances. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, Sri Lanka has a history of enforced disappearances. This started during, it happened during the Sri Lanka has had 2 youth insurrections in the south as well, in the 70s and then in the late 80s. And then it has had, that is the Sinhalese youth. And then you've had the Tamil armed struggle, which is Tamil youth. And that started from the 1983 riots is looked as, but of course the conflict was there earlier and the armed groups were in existence even before that. But in 1983, when the riots took place, is viewed as the start of the conflict, the internal armed conflict. And so the enforced disappearances, we've had a history of that even during the JVP insurrections and clearly during the internal armed conflict. So we've had disappearances by the police, by the armed military. So enforced disappearances are when they arrest a person or they abduct a person, state authorities, and you do not know their place of detention. You do not know their whereabouts. And so we've had, I think Sri Lanka is now second or third. There is a UN working group on enforced disappearances, which monitors disappearances globally, and to which people can also submit complaints of enforced disappearances. I think Sri Lanka is now second or third on that list.
It is second, actually. I think it is behind Syria, right. Actually.
Okay, right. Yeah, because that was earlier. Iraq was number 1, and then I think it's all shifted to, yeah. So we've had that. We have had one common way of disappearing people was the white van phenomenon. And this was something that began during the Rajapaksa era, which was a white van would come without number plates, and white because it's the most common color. You cannot find it. And they would take the person away and the person would never be seen. We've had for instance, there was a case where 11 men from Colombo were abducted, and that was done for ransom. It was also had the complicit of the Navy, and they were taken to the naval base in Trincomalee, where they were held, and for a period of time they were even allowed to communicate with their families, and then communication stopped. So there are also witnesses who seem to indicate that then they were thereafter killed and their bodies dumped. That case is still ongoing in court. And one of the people implicated in that was the one of the commanders of the Navy. that he had knowledge of it, and he definitely had knowledge that this was taking place. And even the person you mentioned, Sarath Fonseca, former army commander, he's also supposed to have run a unit, a disappearance unit, a unit that was just carrying out disappearances. So we have a history of it, and if you look at the JVP disappearances we've also had many presidential commissions that have inquired into these disappearances. They have published reports. They have also, those reports include recommendations on what the state needs to do to address the issue. But of course, the state has never done that. So those recommendations remain unimplemented. Some of the reports of these commissions have not been released even into the public domain. In other instances, they've released the report, but they've not released the list of perpetrators. So we don't actually know who the perpetrators are. Or we don't know who the perpetrators identified by these commissions are. Where the JVP late 1980s insurrection is concerned, those families, they're not vocal anymore. They're not demanding truth and justice, also because the parents have passed away or the wife has passed away and the children and siblings have really no interest in this. So they get on with their lives, and there are only a few who still talk about this. And then, of course, we have the disappearances that took place in the north and the east. This was not just done by the military or the police. It was also done by the Tamil paramilitary groups. But I call them political armed groups because they were political parties, but they had armed cadres and they were working with the government sort of in a paramilitary capacity. So they also undertook disappearance. They also disappeared people. This was sometimes just for, as a means of extortion. At other times, at the behest of the security agencies. Sometimes it was both. And also there were instances where these Tamil political armed groups would help, quote unquote, help families whose family members had been arrested and could possibly be disappeared, would help these families secure their release from the military or the police for a sum of money. So that's just, and now, of course, for more than 5,000 days, families from the north and the east, families that disappeared, have been protesting, demanding truth and justice. And these families have been subject to surveillance, intimidation, harassment, threats by the different security agencies. So even today, I was at Mullivaikkaal, and there was a woman who was part of this. And while she was standing there right next to me, her phone kept ringing incessantly. And she said, oh, well, that it was some CID officer. CID is the Criminal Investigation Department. It's also an acronym they commonly use to refer to, it could be people from the Terrorism Investigation Department, or it could also be military intelligence. But anyway, you get the point. There are people kind of monitoring and harassing. So she was saying it was some CID person who kept calling her clearly to ask where she was, what she was doing, what was going on at the event. So that, despite that, this group, which consists mainly of women, they have been struggling, they have been protesting, and they also face problems at home, because when they go out for these protests at home, they say, well, why on earth are you still doing this? So they have personal problems as well because of this, but they are, you have to admire their courage and their tenacity that they are continuing their struggle.
How long have they been protesting for?
More than 5,000 days. So they started during the Good Governance government. I think sometime in 2016 they began. So it's a very long time that they have been protesting. And I think it's the longest peaceful protest in Sri Lanka. In the history of Sri Lanka, I would say that is the longest continuous peaceful protest.
Yes. So I believe it actually reached past 6 years at this point. 6 years straight to put
Yeah,
that
so it would be, right? Yeah,
So
it would be. Yes, now 2023. Yeah.
So roughly 6 years at this point, over 6 years, they've been protesting straight every day. Their courage, especially given the sort of the toxic political environment, the hostile political environment that Sri Lanka is it's admirable. The fact that, and a lot of these people live in very heavily militarized portions of the island. They live and they're fighting for their rights. They're fighting for their loved ones. They're fighting to see their loved ones again. And that's sort of the sort of thing that we see happening. It is a struggle against effectively fascism. It is a struggle against nationalism, a nationalist project.
But also the important factor to note is that pretty much nearly all these families are not exactly privileged.
Exactly.
They suffer, they are economically disadvantaged, marginalized, or poor. So that is also why it's exceedingly difficult. They do not have the privilege of protesting, but yet they protest. So we have to recognize that. And that is a pattern we also see when you look at many of the victims of enforced disappearances, or torture or extrajudicial killings, is if they're not of particular groups like, journalists or human rights defenders, if you look at the others, they do tend to come from the economically marginalized and disadvantaged groups.
Wow.
Well, one question I have for the panel is, what can we do to advance the cause and raise people's consciousness about this conflict, and how can outside people lend aid or support? Like, what are the action items that people struggling with this are calling for? What can we do?
Oh wow, tough. People want accountability, but in Sri Lanka, there's no chance of accountability because the state institutions like the Attorney General's Department are not independent, and people have no faith in them. So we know locally, if you file cases, you're really not going to go anywhere. We have a history of that. Cases that are still stuck, years later. So then the other option is, of course, you have the International Criminal Court, but for that you need to have ratified the Rome Statute. Sri Lanka hasn't, in which case you need to be referred by the UN Security Council, but then there's the problem of veto. Then, of course, the third means is, you could set up a special international court, but internationally no one has the appetite for that. I think we're past that period of history. So the only other thing is universal jurisdiction, which you must know about, which is for certain crimes that are deemed particularly heinous, certain countries have laws within their own country that allows them to prosecute these individuals if they pass through that country. So last year in Sweden and in Germany, they convicted persons who'd committed crimes. In one case, it was Iraq, I think more than a decade ago or much longer. And the other one was an individual who'd committed crimes in Syria. But for that, you do need to do a lot of groundwork in terms of gathering evidence, in terms of figuring out which individual has connection to which country, and when, monitor it to see when they're going to pass through. You need to connect with that country, and that country and the prosecutor need to agree to take this on. So you need to build the case. It requires a lot of work. So those are some of the options in terms of accountability. And then, of course, it's about countries that that may speak of, accountability and say we want human rights protected, but at the same time, they would still have military training exercises with Sri Lanka, because also it's geopolitics, and there is this obsession with also China, and then in the Indian Ocean, India versus China. So Sri Lanka gets caught in between the geopolitics as well. So that makes certain things, you can put pressure, but it's like the United States, for instance, is never going to stop its military training. They're just not. But also about funding. So international and bilateral and multilateral bodies also provide funding to Sri Lanka. So what are they funding? What are they supporting? Are they supporting the armed forces? If so, how are they supporting? Of course, in the US, you also have the Leahy vetting now. So if individuals are vetted for human rights violations, and if there are allegations that they're not taken for trainings, etc., all that. And certain military officers have also been sanctioned by the United States, which means they cannot travel to the United States. So those are some of the things that can be done and are being done, and some of the things that possibly can't be done.
By the way, if anyone else wants to ask any questions, feel free to ask. But there's a topic that I believe I wanted to get to. We already hit the forced disappearances. We hit the absolute lack of accountability. We talked about I think we touched upon a little bit of what happened in Mullivaikkaal. We talked about basically the denial of aid into the war-torn parts of the country while the war was coming close to an end. We talked about the Sri Lanka's complicity in that. Well, they're obviously to blame for all of that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit, was sort of how we got to this point in time, which was Black July and sort of the burning of the Jaffna Public Library. I think those two were major. I think those two were major events that eventually helped this sort of conflict snowball out of control. In addition to acts such as the Sinhala Only Act passed by, SWRD and among other laws like that, which also ratcheted tensions as well. But if we could talk a little bit about Black July and the burning of the Jaffna Library, just sort of, we're at the end of the timeline right now. We're at where we are right now. But let's take a little step back to the beginning and how we got here, if that's okay.
Black July, yes, 1983. That was there was soldiers were ambushed in the north by the LTTE. They were killed, and their bodies were brought to Colombo for the funeral. And that night is when, and there was already tension, and they started the burning and looting of Tamil houses in the capital, Colombo, and also in certain other places. And that was not a random incident. We call it a pogrom because it was something that was state-sponsored. Mobs that went house to house had electoral lists in their hands. So they knew who lived where, and they knew which household was Tamil and which house was Sinhalese or Muslim, which is why the Sinhalese and Muslim houses were left untouched, whereas the Tamil houses were attacked. So it was in Colombo and in certain parts of the even the hill country and certain other parts of the country. There were people killed. I think there's a very famous photograph from that time, which is a man who's been stripped naked and he's seated. He has his head. He's holding his head in his hands, is utter despair, and there is these men who seem cocky and are just surrounding him. And that is just a photograph, but what happened afterwards is that the man was killed. So that was the beginning of this large-scale violence, was the beginning of the ethnic conflict or the internal armed conflict proper, because that is also something that drove scores of Tamil youth in the north and the east towards these armed groups, one of which was the LTTE. because they felt that, they had to take up arms against the state because they did not feel that the state was protecting them. Instead, the state had become the predator.
And so this is effectively what led to the beginning of the Civil War. This is what ratcheted up tensions. And as Ambika,
that's right.
Yes, so this is the beginning of the Civil War. This started in 1983. So this was the sort of pogrom. It is a literal pogrom against the ethnic, I believe. It was against basically all the varieties of Tamils. So it happened in Colombo as well. It also happened in the hill regions, in particularly Kandy, the central region, where the estate Tamils, the hill Tamils lived. And also, I believe, did it happen in the north and the east as well? It happened there as well, right?
In the north and the east, well, no, not really, because the north and the east were Tamil majority. So, for instance, when it happened in the south, we went by ship to the north because the north was looked upon as a place of safety.
So, and the other thing, I think you mentioned this, but I just want to reiterate, someone in my chat who is Sri Lankan Tamil, they basically word tested Tamils. Basically, what they would do is they would actually,
yes.
Yeah, so what they did is they would actually say a word in the Sinhala language. So the mobs, the sort of fascist nationalist mobs would say a word in the Sinhala language to see whether or not the person would say it natively like a Sinhalese person. And if they didn't, they would beat them to death on the spot. So that was another common practice during the Black July. The sort of that was a common practice during the Black July riots, the Black July pogroms. The other thing, did we cover the burning of the Jaffna Library in this, or just to double check? I want to make sure.
No, that was also it was one of the ministers at the time was said to be behind the burning of the Jaffna Library, and he's supposed to have been in Jaffna at a particular guest house and seeing the flames, the library being engulfed in flames. Now, the Jaffna Library had very valuable manuscripts and books that were also related to the history and the culture of the Tamil people. And so it was also a targeting, I suppose, of something that was very important because it also held pride of place. And of course, like everything else, no one was held accountable, and the library remained shelved for many years until it was rebuilt much, later. But of course, the loss of the manuscripts, the books, those irreplaceable items, I think that they achieved their aim, which was, in a sense, to destroy it and to teach the people a lesson and to rob them of something that was very important to them.
Yeah, these were, by the way, priceless manuscripts, historical manuscripts. They were, we call them, there's a word called ole chuvri, which is palm leaf. Yes, there were lots of ole chuvris, which are palm leaf, or is it palm leaf or is it banana leaf manuscriptures? Where basically these are very centuries, if not, I think maybe even 1,000 years old manuscripts, and this is of poetry of I think a copy of the Tirukural was also there, wasn't it? A copy of the Kurals was also there.
I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, the point is, these were priceless cultural artifacts that were up in smoke, and this was largely at the hands of fascist mobs, very very ostensibly, nationalist mobs. And I believe they were also helped by the police. Is that right?
Yes, and of course the police always stand by while it's happening.
Yes.
Which is also even during the 1983 riots, and it is something that continues to this day because apparently, we saw even during the Aragalaya, which is the struggle that began in the south to force President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to resign last year. And when the main protest site was attacked by supporters of Mahinda Rajapaksa, the police stood by and did nothing. And apparently even today in Colombo, they'd had an event to mark May 18th. And some Sinhala nationalist groups, racist groups, who also have had, some of them had a hand in anti-Muslim violence, by the way. Those groups had turned up at the site and tried to disrupt the event. And of course, the police who were standing there did absolutely nothing, I hear.
I mean, this is a story as old as time. The authorities do not do anything when, their sort of people, you can say that, are doing violence. When they're on the side of the people doing the violence, of course, they're not going to do anything. So that's largely the starting part of the Civil War. We've covered the sort of end of the Civil War. We've talked about the forced disappearances, the ongoing Sinhalization of the North and the East, the sort of colonialist project of the current government. I want to have a little bit more fun, quote unquote, in the sense of, I just want to explore the sort of why it's been so, why there's a massive amount of inertia, and the reason for that is because of Sri Lanka's very rotten political system, which I think Ambika and I had a conversation about last night. Let's start with a quote by former President Chandrika Kumaratunga. Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga. And basically what she said was, this is a former president that said, Sri Lanka has effectively been governed by 5 families for the past several decades. The vast majority of people that have ruled Sri Lanka have come from 5 families. Generally speaking, that is a correct statement. Is that not correct, Ambika?
Yes. I mean, we've had family politics, absolutely. But of course, what she failed to mention was one of the families was hers.
Exactly. Her father was SWRD Bandaranaike, Solomon Bandaranaike, for whom, by the way, the Colombo airport is named after. And he was the one that instituted the Sinhala Only Act in the 50s. 1956. He instituted the Sinhala Only Act, and SWRD's main claim to politics is actually that it is his main claim to fame in Sri Lankan politics is Sinhalese chauvinism. It is basically Sri Lanka at the time it was Ceylon, but Ceylon for the Sinhalese. That was his claim to fame for politics.
But also, what was interesting is that that was clearly a very well thought out political strategy, because he himself was very westernized and I think very elitist and classist. And so this was not something that he believed in, but he used as a political weapon. And that you find is very common in Sri Lankan politics. They know this works, so they use it, but the actual, who they are and how they live and their private lives are in complete contradiction to what they espouse.
Right. And actually, you see this a lot. It's actually the introduction of the Rajapaksas where the nepotism and the political rot has not necessarily been democratized to the same degree, but I would say you see it take more of a populist form, more of a sort of general populist form, right-wing populist, a fashion. I mean, Sri Lanka has always been, one of the underlying political sort of layers of it has always been Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism, but you see that sort of ratchet up and sort of more. I don't know if democratize is the word. That's the word we used last night in our conversation, but it basically brought that sort of bare political rot and to the masses, because Rajapaksa's family eventually became powerful and entered the government, but the Rajapaksa family does not come from the same pedigree that the Bandaranaike family or the Vijayawardena family, that is the family of two presidents, that is J.R. Jayawardena, as well as the current president, Ranil Wickremesinghe. The Rajapaksas do not carry the same sort of pedigree, or neither do the Premadasas. The Premadasas also do not come from a landed or aristocratic background either. That's a very common theme in Sri Lankan politics. It's quite literally, it is a very common theme that for a long time, you effectively have aristocratic families that have been running this country effectively since independence. What is it like? What are some examples of like the worst forms of political rot that you've seen, Ambika?
Oh, wow.
I know it's a hard question. It's a hard question given it's Sri Lanka, so there's a lot of good answers, but.
Oh God, I'm just trying to think. I thought, what's the worst kind of political rot? Well, it's just everything, is it? I mean, it's just the sense of entitlement that people have. Now, if you take even the Rajapaksas, for instance, the fact that if you read Gotabaya Rajapaksa's biography, it says that Mahinda Rajapaksa, after he won the election, came out, saw his brother waiting there and said, "You are my Secretary of Defense." And the fact that you believe that is part of the rot, the sense of entitlement that you have, and you believe the power is absolute and you treat it like it's your personal property and fiefdom, and you can apportion it out and give it to whoever you please. That is part of it, because even, everyday statements made by Mahinda Rajapaksa's son and how they view this as their entitlement. How, when they're appointed, these ministers, they bring in their sons and their daughters and their wives as their coordinating secretaries and get them all paid by the state. How they abuse state resources, not to mention the immense corruption that takes place, and all of it normalized. The fact that many of the people who were, because there is a culture of people who help these politicians, who function as thugs and help these politicians, are thereafter then brought into through elections, brought into the local government, then maybe provincial government, then into the national parliament. So you do have a lot of people who have no clue, no idea about even basic democratic values. And those values certainly have not been internalized. We do not know what accountability means, what transparency means, what conflict of interest means, what nepotism means. We have absolutely no idea what process means. So if someone wants to get something done in Sri Lanka, anyone, they would first, instead of looking at, so what is the process here? Instead of checking the website or asking someone to find that out, they would first say, okay, who do we know there? Who do we know there? That is the most normal way of getting things done. So even if I ask someone, so how does one do this at this place? And they ask me, don't you know someone there? And I'm like, I'm asking for the process. So that just generally is not just, it's a culture that still has feudal elements. And one of the ways in which the political parties or, they maintain control is through dispensation of patronage, which is why certain ministries are deemed very lucrative, because you can give a lot of jobs through that, like the Samurdhi ministry. Samurdhi is a sort of a social protection kind of small pittance of an allowance that they give. And the Ports Authority is another entity, through which you can give jobs, which means you can dispense patronage. So certain ministries are thought to be very lucrative, and there is quite a bit of competition for that. So those are some ways in which, and of course, even the then president and later prime minister Mahinda Rajapaksa be accused of corruption, that of embezzling or, redirecting funds that were received for tsunami relief after the tsunami. It's called Helping Hambantota because that was the name of that program. And through that, how he
coincidentally, sorry to cut you off. Helping Hambantota, by the way, coincidentally enough, is the Rajapaksas' hometown, where they built what Forbes deemed the world's emptiest airport based on loans borrowed from banks in China. So effectively what happened was, sorry to cut you off, one of the reasons for the economic collapse that happened in 2022 was because of reckless borrowing done by the Rajapaksas. And it's partially due to the sort of, and they built a sort of airport in they built an international airport in his hometown. And it especially because of COVID, it ended up being converted into a rice silo. Sorry, I just wanted to pop off that one point because I think that is it is one of the most comical things I've ever heard coming out of any sort of country's politics. But continue.
Can I jump in right here? I wanted to thank you all for this conversation, and I feel like my community and I learned a lot. Is there any other resources, because I think I actually have to go, I have to jump, but is there any other resources that we can take a look at to, further our knowledge and further, is there anything acute happening right now that we can draw attention to or provide support for?
I mean, yes, there are a lot of resources that you could, even just by Googling, because there are various reports that local institutions and individuals have published. There are reports by Amnesty International, International Crisis Group, the International Commission of Jurists, Human Rights Watch, not to mention the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, because there is a resolution at the UN Human Rights Council on Sri Lanka, and as part of that, the High Commissioner has to submit reports on the situation in Sri Lanka. So you do have a lot of resources out there. And of course, talking about international failure, after the end of the war, there was an internal inquiry done in the UN led by Charles Petrie. They published a report. It's called, they call it the Petrie Report, which talks about, is a terrible indictment of the UN's failures in Sri Lanka. It's all about how the UN failed. And that led to the UN Secretary General at the time coming up with this program called Rights Up Front. And the purpose of Rights Up Front was for the UN system to always incorporate or work from the point of view of, from a rights perspective, not just the Human Rights Agency, but all agency, and to put human rights front and center. But that Rights Up Front program now is nearly forgotten. No one even remembers it, let alone practice it.
Well, are there any NGOs or things that we can direct funds towards?
Well, the funds, funding is a problem in Sri Lanka because they are cracking down, or they want to pass legislation to control NGOs receiving foreign funds. And they've been trying to bring restrictive legislation. So there aren't any organizations that receive just, kind of donations, and they don't have that set up on their websites like many others in the Western world do. But if people do want to, then of course we could direct them to different organizations that, depending on the areas that they would like to support or the issues that they would like to support, we could definitely direct them to institutions.
Well, thank you all for that conversation and the information, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on with all of you. All right, well, thank you so much, and all of you have a wonderful rest of your day.
So we were talking about the massive corruption, and if basically there's another point that I this sort of political rot in Sri Lanka, which is partially what leads to the inertia. On top of that, I shared I think some of the people in this call may have seen it, but it's a call. It is a video that went actually viral in Sri Lanka regarding involving the foreign minister of Sri Lanka by the name of Ali Sabri, effectively breaking down in Parliament, basically calling parliamentarian Chanakyan a communalist bastard. Which I had a good laugh with it. I had fun making fun of him. But what that also illustrates is, and I think I'm using him as a point to basically get to illustrate how did Ali Sabri get that position in the first place? How did he become foreign minister in the first place? And
that's because he sorry, go on.
No, I'm just teeing it up for you to basically tell everyone.
He's not an elected member of parliament in Sri Lanka. The process is such, if depending on how many seats a political party wins, you also get the number of, proportionally you get a number of bonus seats. These seats are called the national list. And the purpose of a national list is to bring into parliament people who would otherwise not stand for election, people who have particular expertise. So the political parties before the elections are supposed to post their national lists, with 1, 2, 3, 4, just numbering different people, saying these are the people, or, depending on the number of seats they get, these are the people who will be appointed to those seats. So he's someone who came in through that way. And it is Mahinda Rajapaksa's party that nominated him to a national list seat. And that is how he became a member of parliament and was thereafter appointed. He was first, he's been through all the ministries, right? First, he was justice minister. Then he was minister of finance. And then now foreign minister.
Yep.
Also all important ministries. And his background is that he's a practicing lawyer, but he was also Gotabaya Rajapaksa's personal lawyer, has a very close relationship with him, is very loyal to him, and Gotabaya clearly trusts him implicitly. So that is how and why he got the job. Another example of the political rot you wanted, well, here we have yet another.
Yeah. This is it's an example of you scratch my back, I scratch your back, and it really goes down to it is genuinely like whenever I talk about Sri Lankan politics. Every time it somehow manages to get worse. It genuinely does, and it is a political rot that has existed in Sri Lanka for a long time. I want to switch gears a little bit, and away from sort of the overall politics of Sri Lanka. You've also done some work regarding, advocating for feminism in Sri Lanka. You've also advocated for, you've also done a lot of work being a feminist activist. Sort of what are some of the biggest issues that women face in Sri Lanka? I know it's a very general question, but sort of what are the biggest ones that you're seeing right now?
Oh, God, where does one begin? Well, I mean, it's a deeply patriarchal, misogynistic society. So everywhere you turn, you're going to find problems. Everything from street harassment to sexual harassment at work to discrimination to, gender, children, even at homes, those gender roles, children being forced to adhere to those gender roles and stereotypes, to gender-based violence. There's a lot of that as well. And of course, economic marginalization as well, because women, for instance, in certain industries, like women make up the majority of also like the large number of the agricultural workers If you take the informal sector, like, you know, domestic workers, women are the majority there as well, and therefore they receive little protection. In certain industries where the conditions aren't great and there can be exploitation also, like the garment factories. Once again, it's women who work there. So even I would say legally too, we do have certain laws that do still discriminate against them. There aren't adequate protections. So I would say legally, economically, socially, yes, we do have a problem. There is discrimination and there is violence. We have a large number of women heads of households due to the end of the war, and they live a very precarious life, particularly economically. Yeah, I'm just that I would say.
Just to interject for a second. So there's a point that I wanted to get off earlier that I wanted to basically say. There's a report that I think that came out, it was like in the 2010s that it came out. And what it showed was that the median incomes of the northern towns of Sri Lanka, basically the Tamil-dominated towns of Sri Lanka, they are by and far less than the southern cities of Sri Lanka. And I think the worst of it was either Kilinochchi or Mullivaikkaal. I think those were the two poorest cities in terms of median income. That was another point that I wanted to basically relay to everyone. That is, when we talk about the Civil War, it's the remnants of it are still happening today, and it's partially due to, like we mentioned earlier, the sort of ongoing state colonization project that has been happening, the Sinhalization project, the settler project that has been happening at the hands of the state. But on top of that, this is a serious economic issue that, as it affects women in that they live in cities that don't get that much income. They're not earning that much income because they come from war-torn families. We have to have like an intersectional approach to all of this. Thank you for basically elucidating everyone's thank you for showing everyone what the sort of the conditions are for women in Sri Lanka. And also, you are I take it, I saw this in an interview of yours. I think it was She Slays, the name of the interview. You said you would write a book about why prisons should be abolished. I'd like to pick your brain on that a little bit, because I just want to know what sort of conditions you saw in the Sri Lankan prisons that would, obviously, it's not that common a sort of position to have, especially when you, at least as far as I know, the way I would imagine is that if you work for, the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, as well as the UN, you would imagine that these sort of views would be tempered. But I wanted to pick your brain on that a little bit before, I just want to see what conditions you saw in, the Sri Lankan prisons that would lead you to have an answer like that.
It was not necessarily, not just the conditions. I clearly, as a legally trained person, you never question prisons. You never question that. Those are things that you view as a given when you study law. And so did I. I didn't really think much about it. And accountability means imprisonment. This is just givens. But when I went to was appointed to the commission, and I started visiting prisons a lot, and because we also started a study of prisons, that 863-page report is on the commission's website if anyone would like to take a look at it. So I started visiting prisons with the research team. And what became very obvious is that, and this is quite similar to countries like even the US or even India, is that most of the people who are in prison are poor. They come from marginalized backgrounds. They are underprivileged. in Sri Lanka, more than 60% of the persons in prisons were there because they could not pay a fine. Sometimes the fine was as little as 3,000 rupees. And the criminal justice system is dysfunctional. It really does not protect your rights. And even if you have financial resources, it would be slightly difficult. But if you didn't, well, then you're done for. So I felt like what we are doing is we're not addressing the root cause of these problems. So, for instance, even one of the biggest drug traffickers who was extrajudicially killed, he was extradited from Dubai, and then here in an encounter killing, he was killed. But before all that happened, when we were visiting prisons, we would chat to the jailers, the chief jailer. They became known and they would tell us stories. And one of the stories is that about this guy named Madhush. And they said, one of them said that they remembered when he first came to prison. It was like 17 years old for some, altercation or something like that. And then, so they were narrating how, in a way, it was sad to see what he had become. And it was also, there was a instance of his mother being extrajudicially killed because she was a political activist. So instead of addressing the root causes of the problem, we throw people in prison, lock them up, throw away the key, and we expect the problem to be solved. Conditions in prisons are, if you're taking even living conditions, overcrowded cells, no access to sanitation, god-awful food, little access to medical care, that would not, quote-unquote, rehabilitate a person, would just make the person very angry. And also, many of the people in prison really shouldn't be in prison. So what we should be trying to do is to prevent people from coming into conflict with the law. So, for instance, in Sri Lanka, drug use is also criminalized. So many of the drug users are in prison. But as we jokingly say in Sri Lanka, many of the drug traffickers are in parliament.
That's true.
So that is why I was like, God, prisons are such a bad idea. And then when you go to prison, everyone thinks, oh, people in prison are really these awful, terrible human beings. They're wicked human beings. But then you see the human side of them. Then you also see the people in positions of power who are really god-awful human beings without empathy, who are cruel, who are brutal, and they're out there and they're in positions of power. And these poor people, literally poor people, are in prison. How does that make sense? And the criminal justice system is so skewed in favor of the privileged. So I was like, no, why do we need prisons? We really should not be building prisons. We must try to find ways to close down prisons, to actually solve social problems. Instead of exacerbating them. But of course, yes, but I'm still thinking it through because, for instance, most of this abolitionist thinking comes mainly from the US, not from anywhere else. And in the US, of course, the abolitionist thinking, the writing that I have read, doesn't really deal with things like, for instance, war crimes, crimes against humanity. What do you do with people who do that? And what do you do with victims who are large communities? What do you do? Things like that. It hasn't really dealt with because they've dealt with the African Americans, over incarceration of it and things like that. So I think I am still thinking it through, but I do think a large number of people in prison really shouldn't be in prison, and we cannot create a safe society by sending people to prison.
Agreed. Absolutely. I think that's the sentiment that everyone on this panel will actually agree with on.
Yeah, we have an expression among the Western left. It applies to borders and to prisons. The existence of a prison implies the violence of their maintenance, that you have to be violent and maintain that violence to keep those institutions, running. A prison doesn't stay a prison while there aren't police to enforce that violence and bring people there.
And then they are subject to violence in prison, and then they
Exactly.
go out, and you expect them to do what exactly? I mean,
Yeah.
You create the person, like even for instance, we have compulsory drug rehabilitation in Sri Lanka. and two of the largest drug rehab centers are run by the military, where violence is normal from the minute you enter to the minute you leave. People are subject to violence, and people I've interviewed who've been to those centers, they say when they come out of the centers, they're just angry. They're angry with the family, angry with the police, angry with the military, angry with the state, just angry with society, everyone. And as soon as they come out, what do they do within a day or two? They start using again, because they're like, we're just so angry and we cannot trust anyone. We have no support mechanisms. And so therefore, these systems don't really solve the problem by forcing people to go into drug rehab and then subjecting them to violence. Really does not solve anything.
And they're not meant to solve it.
No, exactly. I mean, they are portrayed as meaning that they intend to solve it, but I suppose they're not.
Yeah. Arun and Ambika, I want to thank both of you for being such a wealth of knowledge today. These topics are always very difficult to grapple with because they're so vast and wide-reaching, and there's so many factors that have contributed to the history of this. And I just want to thank both of you for giving your time and your mental health to try and educate us on a topic that we never learn about within Western schools or within Western media. So I wanted to thank both of you before I have to head out for the rest of the day. I've got an interview in a little bit that I have to get to.
Thank you so much for showing up, Grandma. I genuinely appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. And you, Ambika, I hope your work reaches more ears. You as well, Arun. Again, yeah, thank you so much for contributing to the conversation today. It's been incredibly informative.
For the rest of the people on the panel, do you guys have any more questions for Ambika? I know.
Yeah, because I will also have to go soon because I've I arrived.
Yeah, no worries. I don't want to keep you. I know you've been here for quite a while. I don't want to keep you here for too long. So speaking of which, I wanted to pick your brain about one thing, Ambika, and it is why. So what is some of the reasons that we've never heard about? We don't hear about this sort of thing in the West. What is one of the reasons that we don't really see? We don't hear. I guess like the first question is like whenever people hear anything about Sri Lanka. I mean, I mentioned this to you last night. Whenever people say anything about Sri Lanka, it is there are two words that pop out of their mouth. It's Tamil tigers, right? And that's because I would imagine that's because the majority of the coverage of Sri Lanka was during the war, and the entire framing of it was the Tamil tigers are doing this, the Tamil tigers are doing that. But why has it been, at least on at least in a sort of ground level, or at least in a sort of at least in these sorts of like the left circles in the United States, and I don't know how much you can speak to that. I have my own hypotheses as to why they've probably never heard of this, but what is sort of your take on why this doesn't get as much coverage? And there are lots of issues across the world that doesn't really that don't really get sort of their due coverage. I think Western Sahara is one example. West Papua is another example that doesn't really get that much due coverage. What do you think what do you think are the reasons as to why we don't see that much coverage around this sort of the ongoing issues in Sri Lanka?
Well, I'm not sure. As I said to you, earlier today, I think for a country the size of Sri Lanka and not much, in a sense, relevance, it's received quite a bit of coverage from international media, and of course during the war, but even afterwards at different times, also because of the UN Human Rights Resolution. And then, of course, the Aragalaya, last year, it received a lot of coverage. We had all sorts of news channels here. But of course, it's about when something happens, and that I think is common to many places, where when an incident happens, there's coverage, and then it becomes sort of normal. Of course, in the country, it's still happening, but the media cannot find an angle which they feel is sellable, so they don't bother with the story. And we saw that. So, for instance, even foreign media outlets would ask me for a voice cut or an interview. I think once it was before the the resolution was renewed because there was a lot of buzz around the resolution, or it was during the Aragalaya, or when something like the ATA happens, then you would have interest. So in that sense, I'm not sure for a country the size of Sri Lanka and little global relevance, we've received quite a bit of time, space, and particularly in international spheres like the UN, the Human Rights Council, the European Union, the European Parliament, and particularly the US as well, because there's the Tamil diaspora does quite a bit of lobbying in Washington.
Well, so actually, sorry to cut you off. I guess the question that I wanted to ask was, I guess let me frame it better. I think the question that I was trying to ask is, I don't think you see as much coverage of the Sinhalization, at least from what I've seen. It's not.
Right. No.
Yeah. So you don't.
But even locally, it doesn't. Even locally, it doesn't receive it because there's still, people can't acknowledge it. And I suppose it has also been documented a lot. I mean, there was a report by the Oakland Institute last year. There have been certain other reports, but there hasn't been even locally consistent documentation of it. I suppose we might have more of that because it's escalated in the last year, and even local media, there's more reportage of it. But right now, no, because it's not, even nationally, it's not acknowledged as an issue, and it's not, that's probably also why.
Okay, so it's basically the fact that it is well documented. It's just that, again, no one wants to take accountability. Is that generally the answer?
I mean, but there's a lot that is not documented that is going on. There's a lot that is not documented, a lot. So we do need to pull our socks up and do that. But of course, I mean, no one wants to acknowledge it here. I mean, you might have seen on Twitter, even when I talk about it, the kind of racist backlash, the comments, the replies that I get is like, I just ignore all of them and do not respond to a single one. And I don't block them either. But it's like that. And also the Sinhalization gets that. It's funny. It's interesting. That earlier when I used to talk about the military, I used to get it. Now, no, I don't. No one bothers. Now it's Sinhalization. And of course, now this whole memorialization and the use of the word genocide is when the racists really come out of the woodwork. And
I can personally attest to that. I can personally attest to me using the word genocide leading to backlash, as there was a point in time where there was this one person that was a Sinhalese nationalist that saw me talk about what is going on in Sri Lanka, and they actually tried to get me banned off the platform, or they tried to get me literally tried to silence me, and it goes to show sort of the massive and on top of that, I believe MIA, the famous artist MIA, was continuously shut down. Every single time she brought up that issue. And it's because it is an issue that no one wants to actually address. It is a bare, open, plain in your face example of it is an open parallel of incidents that you would have seen in other countries. This is what we're seeing in Sri Lanka is certainly not unique. It is absolutely not unique to Sri Lanka by any stretch of the measure. This happens in every country. But I think what's interesting is that the inertia and the resistance to even talking about this, I think is very interesting. And the way it is handled, this topic is handled in Sri Lanka, I think is somewhat unique to Sri Lanka in the sense of just merely saying a word will get you in a lot of trouble. Merely, saying those two words will get you in a lot of trouble, even though whatever your opinion on the word being applied to this current situation is, saying that word should not it is not an arrestable offense in Sri Lanka, but
not at all.
It is not an arrestable offense in Sri Lanka, but it still manages to get people into trouble, and people simply saying it. The backlash that you received by simply saying, "Hey, like, why are we criminalizing people over the usage of this word? Why are we?"
Is all I said.
Yeah, well, the
I did
racist.
actually say exactly.
Yeah.
That's all I said. Saying it. Yeah, exactly.
Like,
yeah,
why are we arresting people over the, just simply asking why are we arresting people over a word leads to backlash on the subject. That is the sort of, that demonstrates how sort of stacked the deck is. That sort of demonstrates how stacked the deck is when talking about this sort of subject. Go ahead.
But also, what's in the same way concerning is that whether you agree or disagree, I mean, even civil society, you might not agree, you disagree on that. That's completely fine. Not everyone has to agree. And I think even the Tamil community has to accept that. But the fact that even people in civil society might be, or people who are deemed, who view themselves as progressive, would not challenge the fact that someone has been arrested for using this word, that this word is a trigger. It's like saying, I don't agree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. The same thing applies here. You don't agree that it took place, but they have a right to allege it, and if they want to talk about it and to use the word. And if they get arrested for that, then that needs to be defended, their right to say it. But I haven't seen enough. Maybe I've also not been on social media and looking at all the tweets, although I've posted tweets. So I don't know whether many people from Sri Lanka have said this on Twitter or social media. I don't know. I doubt it though, and I think maybe it's only the diaspora Tamils who have. I don't think people here have actually said, why on earth have you arrested this person for the use of the word, and he should be able to use it, and it's not criminalized, and it shouldn't be. The use of the word should not be criminalized de facto or de jure. But I don't think they've said it. I don't know whether you've seen it. I haven't looked, so perhaps that's why I haven't seen it.
I think I may have seen one or two people say it, but I would generally agree with the sentiment that overall, when regarding that particular issue, there's a deafening silence with regards to that issue, and it's because it's like you said, there have been norms that have already been normalized in Sri Lankan society, like, oh, if you speak out against, like, for example, the idea that the army is infallible and everything that they do is right. That has been normalized in society. That has been normalized. I mean, obviously not just in Sri Lanka, but especially in Sri Lanka, though, it has been normalized that the army should be able to do what they're doing right now. The police should be able to do custodial violence. They should be able to do abuse in prison. That sort of stuff has been that sort of sentiment has already been normalized in Sri Lanka, and I think it goes back to not just a sort of it's not just a sort of political rot. It's a societal rot where we and this is obviously not unique to Sri Lanka. India has its own issues too, with regards to the military, but it's this sort of thing has been normalized in Sri Lanka. And that's why we're seeing like any sort of opposition to the sort of the nationalist project of the past several governments be met with such resistance.
Yeah, it's normalized. I mean, the violence of the state, the brutality of the state, everything has been normalized, and that is what the people expect in a sense. Impunity reigns, and that's the problem here. Impunity at every level, top to bottom.
Yeah. First of all, Ambika, thank you so much for joining this. I know you're probably new to when we had our conversation last night, I think you were very new to the concept of Twitch and very new to this whole thing. You're also new to Discord as well. So I want to first of all thank you for cooperating. Thank you for being patient with me as we tried to put this together. It was, but it truly, no, in all seriousness, it is an honor to have you on. It was truly an honor to have you on. You've been fighting the good fight. Chat, if you look at Ambika's like tweets, it is very obvious that she's fighting. She's fighting the system right now and fighting for people's rights. And there's a lot more that we could talk about, but I'm very glad that I could have you on and I'm very happy that I could have you on. I'm thankful that I could have you on to enlighten sort of a broader audience that is already politically minded to begin with in the first place, but that probably doesn't know all that much about this region. That probably doesn't know about Sri Lanka to begin with. And thank you so much for coming on. It's been truly an honor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It's been an interesting conversation.
Thank you. And you're always welcome back
Very
on if you're
appreciated, yeah.
You're always welcome back on.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us all on again. Thank you for organizing this too.
No worries.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Learned a lot today.
No, thank you. Thank you for
yeah.
showing up. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, really
Of
grateful
course.
to have been included as part of it.
Me too.
But
All
yeah,
right, take care.
take care,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Aaron. Bye.
Thanks.